An enormous stone amphitheater stood high above the city, carved into the side of an ancient mountain, where wind moved freely between marble columns and worn steps polished smooth by generations of thinkers who had climbed there to defend ideas they believed would outlive them. And as the sun began to fall behind distant peaks, long shadows stretched across the circular arena, dividing light from darkness with almost symbolic precision. And despite the silence, the place felt alive, not with movement, but with expectation. Because some places are built not for comfort, but for confrontation. And on that evening, philosophers, priests, scholars, soldiers, and students filled the rising rows of stone, not to witness entertainment, but to witness certainty challenged in public. And public certainty has always been stronger than private doubt, until doubt is spoken aloud by someone who no longer needs approval. And at the center of that ancient arena stood Friedrich Nietzsche, calm, unmoving, his dark coat shifting slightly in the mountain wind, as if he had not come to win an argument, but to reveal something already cracking beneath the beliefs of everyone around him. And across from him stood four men, each carrying the confidence of a worldview older than themselves, one wearing the quiet discipline of Stoic, another the robes of a priest, another the sharp eyes of a rational scholar, and another the calm certainty of a moral idealist. And though their beliefs differed, all of them shared one conviction, that truth, virtue, and meaning could be defined, protected, and taught. And that conviction is what brought them there, because ideas rarely fear disagreement. They fear exposure. And one of the men, the Stoic, stepped forward first, his voice controlled, precise, asking whether it was true that Nietzsche believed suffering should not merely be endured, but embraced, and whether chaos, desire, and struggle truly held more wisdom than discipline, reason, and self-control. And the question moved through the amphitheater like wind between columns, because everyone listening recognized that what stood before them was not simply a discussion, but a collision of worlds, and Nietzsche did not answer immediately. And that silence created something unusual, because in places built for debate, silence feels heavier than argument, and heavy silence forces attention. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost soft and expected. And he said that discipline without creation is only elegant obedience. And the words did not land like philosophy. They landed like challenge, and challenge, when aimed at identity, is never easily ignored. And the amphitheater, once filled with expectation, no longer felt entirely safe. The wind did not stop moving between the marble columns. The shadows still stretched across the ancient stone. The audience remained exactly where they had been, eyes fixed on the center of the arena, where centuries of certainty now stood face to face with something far more dangerous than opposition, exposure. And yet, somehow, everything had already begun to feel different, because once an idea begins to move inward, the world outside often becomes quieter, not because it changes, but because attention moves somewhere deeper, somewhere less comfortable. And the philosophers, priests, scholars, and students sitting beneath the fading mountain sun felt that shift, even if they could not fully explain it, because something had been introduced that did not fit with the certainty they had brought with them. And when certainty begins to weaken, awareness begins to grow. And awareness is rarely gentle, because awareness does not remove belief. It removes the stories people use to protect it. And the people surrounding the arena felt that pressure begin to build, not outwardly, but inwardly, because now the question was no longer about discipline. It was about what discipline becomes when it is never questioned. And personal questions are always harder to escape than philosophical ones. And the Stoic standing across from Friedrich Nietzsche no longer carried the same effortless confidence he had brought to the arena. And after several silent breaths, he stepped forward again, his voice still controlled, but no longer untouched, and asked whether Nietzsche believed discipline itself was weakness, whether order, self-control, and emotional restraint were nothing more than chains disguised as wisdom. And the question carried something new, not superiority, not performance, but unease. And unease is always more honest than certainty, because it appears when something real has finally been touched. And Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that discipline becomes weakness the moment it teaches a person how to endure life, but not how to create one. And the words moved through the amphitheater differently this time, because they did not attack restraint. They exposed limitation. And exposure is far more difficult to resist than contradiction, because contradiction creates defense, but exposure creates reflection. And reflection is slower, heavier, and far more difficult to escape. And Nietzsche continued, saying that many people call self-control wisdom simply because they were never brave enough to discover what might happen if they stopped controlling everything. And the words settled into the stone arena with quiet weight, because they did not describe discipline as strength, they described it as safety, and safety is something people rarely recognize as danger, because what feels responsible often hides fear, and what feels balanced often hides surrender, and the audience felt that idea begin to move through them, not as agreement, but as tension, because now discipline was no longer a virtue carved into philosophy, no longer a principle taught by teachers, no longer a code repeated by tradition. It had become something far more personal, something internal, something that reached beyond the arena itself. And before the Stoic could answer, the priest stepped forward, robes shifting softly in the mountain wind, his eyes fixed on Nietzsche, with the kind of calm that comes from believing one speaks not for oneself, but for eternity. And he asked whether Nietzsche truly believed that man could create meaning without God, without divine order, without moral law, without something greater than human desire to guide the chaos within. And the question moved through the amphitheater like thunder before a storm, because everyone listening recognized that what had begun as philosophy was now moving towards something far older, far deeper, far more dangerous. And Nietzsche looked toward him, not with hostility, not with mockery, but with clarity, and after a silence that felt longer than it was, he said that the greatest danger is not living without God. It is living your entire life with borrowed meaning. The wind did not stop moving between the marble columns. The shadows still stretched across the ancient stone. The audience remained exactly where they had been, eyes fixed on the center of the arena, where centuries of certainty now stood face to face with something far more dangerous than opposition, exposure. And yet, somehow, everything had already begun to feel different. And the words did not land like argument. They landed like fracture. And fractures, once visible, are impossible to unsee. The audience did not move. The wind still moved between the columns. But something inside the arena had already begun to break. Because what they were feeling was not disagreement. It was something far more unsettling. A quiet realization that beliefs defended for a lifetime may never have been chosen, only inherited. And for the first time, certainty no longer felt eternal. It felt borrowed. The sun had almost disappeared behind the mountains. The marble columns still stood exactly where generations had built them. The wind still moved through the ancient amphitheater as if nothing had changed. And yet, somehow, none of it felt the same. Because something had shifted, not in the stone, not in the shadows stretching across the arena, not in the faces of philosophers, priests, scholars, and students who remained frozen in silence, but in the way certainty itself was now being understood. And that difference was enough to change everything. Because once a person begins to question the origin of what they believe, belief itself no longer feels permanent, and the people sitting high above the circular arena felt it, even if they could not fully explain it. Because something had been introduced that did not require agreement to exist, something that had already begun to alter the way they understood discipline, morality, faith, duty, and invisible structures each of them had, built long before they ever learned to question them. And that alteration is what makes an idea dangerous, not because it creates enemies, but because it removes excuses. And Friedrich Nietzsche stood calmly within that silence, not as someone untouched by doubt, but as someone who had stopped asking doubt to be comfortable, and that difference was impossible not to notice, because comfort protects people, but uncertainty transforms them, and the rational scholar who had remained silent until now finally stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression disciplined, almost untouched, and he asked the question that many in the amphitheater had already begun asking themselves in silence, asking whether Nietzsche believed that all systems, all philosophies, all religions, all moral structures, and all human truths were nothing more than inventions, and the question carried something new, not superiority, not challenge, but honesty. And honesty is always heavier than certainty, because it appears when performance finally ends. And Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that invention is not the problem, unconscious obedience is. And the words moved through the amphitheater with a kind of quiet force, because they did not destroy systems, they exposed dependence. And dependence is far more difficult to confront than contradiction, because contradiction creates defense. But dependence creates recognition, and recognition, once it begins, cannot be easily undone. And Nietzsche continued, saying that people do not fear false ideas nearly as much as they fear losing the identities built around them, because once a belief becomes identity, questioning it no longer feels like learning, it feels like death, and the audience felt that idea settle into them with quiet weight, because now philosophy was no longer something discussed between thinkers, no longer something written into books, no longer something defended in public debates. It had become something far more personal, something internal, something that reached beyond the arena itself, and the priest lowered his eyes. The Stoic remained motionless. The scholar said nothing, because now the question was no longer whether Nietzsche was right. It was whether they had ever truly chosen what they defended. The sun had almost disappeared behind the mountains. The marble columns still stood exactly where generations had built them. The wind still moved through the ancient amphitheater as if nothing had changed. And yet, somehow, none of it felt the same. And Nietzsche, seeing that shift, did not raise his voice, did not celebrate, did not claim victory, because truth does not need applause. And after one final silence, he looked toward the thousands of faces carved into shadow and fading sunlight, and he spoke one last time, saying that the strongest mind is not the one that defends what was taught, but the one willing to stand alone after discovering it was wrong. And the words settled deeper than anything before them, because they did not promise meaning, they demanded creation. And creation is always heavier than inheritance, because inheritance asks you to continue, but creation asks you to become. And no one spoke after that, because there was nothing left to defend, nothing left to laugh at, nothing left to hide behind. And as Friedrich Nietzsche disappeared slowly into the mountain shadows beyond the arena, the philosophers remained exactly where they were, and yet none of them felt the same. Because once a person realizes that certainty was never proof of truth, only proof of repetition, they cannot fully return to the comfort of who they used to be.